Welcome to part 2 of Wisdom for Living Life Well. Last week we introduced the book of James, and we saw that as he writes to believers who scattered outside of Israel amongst the different nations, he wants to encourage them with at least these three things. Firstly, that trials actually serve a good purpose in their lives. And secondly, that there's a distinction between trials and temptation, that God doesn't tempt anyone. He's not wanting to trip us up or cause us to fall in disgrace. But thirdly, rather, he wants the testing of our faith to produce a steadfastness and endurance so that we come through with a maturity, a completeness, a wholeheartedness. When Jesus said to his 12 disciples, "What does it profit a man if he gains the whole world but loses his own soul?" He didn't expect one of the 12 to put up their hands and give an answer, because it's what we call a rhetorical question. They knew the answer, that to gain an abundance of possessions at the expense of losing our soul is crazy. And in the same way, James wants to say that when we face trials in our lives with this understanding that the most precious thing that we carry with us into all eternity is that of our soul, the character of who we become through our life here on earth. And so today we're going to look at James talking to us about wisdom in two different places. Let's read from James chapter 1. We'll pick up in verse 2 where we began last week, because I want you to see the connection into verse 5 about wisdom. "Consider all joy, my brothers and sisters, when you meet trials of various kinds, for you know that the testing of your faith produces steadfastness. And let steadfastness have its full effect, that you may be perfect and complete, lacking in nothing. If any of you lacks wisdom, let him ask God, who gives generously to all without reproach, and it will be given him." There's been many times when I've spoken out when I shouldn't have, or when I should have said something and remained silent. And Jesus knew exactly when to say something like against the hypocrisy of the religious leaders, or when to remain silent. Peter writes about Jesus in his letter and says that he committed no sin, neither was deceit found in his mouth. When he was reviled, he did not revile in return. When he suffered, he did not threaten, but continued entrusting himself to him who judges justly. Jesus knew how to entrust the outcome to his Father in heaven, that he would work things out perfectly. And so you and I have this wisdom on hand for ourselves. James says that let him ask God, who gives generously to all without reproach. So any of us can come before the throne of God and ask for this wisdom. There's no special hierarchy. It says to all without reproach, meaning that it doesn't matter how we've behaved that day, or God's not putting any judgment on us when we come before him, but gives generously. I mean, Jesus was so generous. When he performs the miracle with the 5,000 and feeds them all, it says afterwards his disciples gathered up 12 baskets full of food. When he turns the water into wine, the host is running out of wine at the wedding, and Jesus, produces almost 700 liters of wine. Imagine somebody bringing out 1,000 bottles of their best wine at the end of the wedding. And God's saying to us, come and ask me, and I'll give to you generously without judgment, and it will be given to him. Sometimes it's not an immediate flash of insight as much as I would like it to be. Sometimes when I've asked God for wisdom, it maybe been the next day in my devotions, or sometimes it's taken longer. It's come through when I've been studying something in the scriptures, or reading a book or an article, or having a conversation with somebody, or some kind of other way that it's been, wow, I remember asking God to help me how to act or what to say, and it's come through in his way and in his timing. And then James goes on to say that we are to ask in faith with no doubting for this wisdom. For the one who doubts is like a wave of the sea that is driven and tossed by the wind. For that person must not suppose that he will receive anything from the Lord. He is a double-minded man, unstable in all his ways. Just so punchy and direct is James. He's saying that, we're not to hedge our bets, in the sense if we don't like God's wisdom, then we'll take a bit of our own wisdom, or we'll take some wisdom from some other guru. But we do trust that God's wisdom is good and right, and it dishonors God if we don't trust him that he's going to give us the best for what we to do in a relationship or in situations that we face. James says in chapter 4 and verse 4, "You adulterous people, do you not know that friendship with the world is enmity with God? Therefore, whoever wishes to be a friend of the world makes himself an enemy of God." And so he's saying that we're not to have this sort of adulterous relationship with God, where we have a little bit of God and a little bit of what we want, but we to fully trust God, that, as we saw last week, that every good gift and every perfect gift is from above, coming down from the Father of lights, with whom there's no variation or shadow due to change. And if we doubt that God is good and wants the best for us, as James says, we're like a wave of the sea that is driven and tossed by the wind. Just last Sunday, there were 10 canoeists out who had gone from Hout Bay Harbour towards the beach. And as they turned around, a northwesterly wind came up, and they were unable to make any progress. They were like this mother of one of the football players used to say on the side of the pitch when Byron was playing with his team. She would shout out when the opposition got the ball in this derisive way, "Going nowhere, slowly." And so there's a sense of you and I just going nowhere. We're tossed and buffeted by the winds, like these canoeists who could make no progress when we don't trust that God has the best for us. And the NSRI had to go and pick up 6 of these canoeists to help them back. So God wants you and I to come and ask him for wisdom. It's something that I ask regularly, almost on a daily basis. God, give me wisdom for this day. Let's jump ahead now to James chapter 3 to see how he expands on this idea of wisdom. As we saw last week, James will often introduce a number of themes, explain them a little bit, but then come back to them later on and expand on them so that we can have greater insights. It's not that his letter doesn't have a flow. We've just seen that he, speaking about trials and the joy of them, and God wanting us to bring our hearts to a place of completeness or wholeness, lacking in nothing. And then he immediately says, if any of you lacks wisdom. And so he's pointing out that we need to be like Jesus, who was dependent on his Father while he walked on the earth, to speak to him and help him in every situation that he faced. Without my Father, I can do nothing, Jesus said. And so this dependence on God for wisdom is something that James would also encourage in you and I. So James chapter 3 and verse 13 says, "Who is wise and understanding among you? By his good conduct, let him show his works in the meekness of wisdom." And typical of James is saying, man, if you say you've got wisdom, let me see it in your actions. And he's picking up on a thought that he introduced in chapter 2, where he said, "So also faith by itself, if it does not have works, is dead. But someone will say, you have faith and I have works. Show me your faith apart from your works, and I will show you my faith by my works." And we won't go into all the theological detail of that, because we'll preach through that section at some other time in this series. But just to point out again that James is very much about, if you say that you are a follower of Christ, then let me see it in your lifestyle, let me see it in your actions. And so our wisdom needs to be seen in how we live, by our good conduct. In the meekness of wisdom, that word meekness in our modern day can sound like being feeble or pathetic, but Jesus was meek, and it's more like a gentleness and an unassuming nature that doesn't boast or become proud, as you'll see now when he says that wisdom from below looks like this in verse 14. "But if you have bitter jealousy and selfish ambition in your hearts, do not boast and be false to the truth. This is not the wisdom that comes down from above, but is earthly, unspiritual, demonic. For where jealousy and selfish ambition exist, there will be disorder in every vile practice. But the wisdom from above is first pure, then peaceable, gentle, open to reason, full of mercy and good fruits, impartial and sincere, and a harvest of righteousness is sown in peace by those who make peace. So James is contrasting wisdom that comes from above, in other words, wisdom that comes from God, and wisdom that is earthly, that the type of wisdom that men would rely on, that is contrary to God's wisdom. And so we want to just have a quick look at what that earthly wisdom looks like, and then look at these 8 characteristics of God's wisdom. Let's read verse 14 again. But if you have bitter jealousy and selfish ambition in your hearts, selfish ambition could be translated as rivalry as well. It's like wanting to get ahead of others, no matter what the cost or at the expense of others. And a bitter jealousy is holding on to that which we have, fearful that somebody else might take it from us. There's not this generosity of heart that we see in God. It's like also envy is wanting what others have and not trusting that what God has given is sufficient for what we need. And James says it's in your hearts, and that's why he'll write in chapter 4 and verse 8, purify your hearts, you double-minded. This double-mindedness comes and surfaces from a place of our hearts. And we know that Jesus said, it is from your hearts that come evil thoughts. And James says, do not boast and be false to the truth. We can see it very well in politics. When politicians are boasting about something or not being truthful because of their ambition or jealousy, it's so obvious. But James is saying that this can also happen amongst ourselves as believers. And this wisdom is not from above, but is earthly. There's no sense of a reference to life beyond this life. And so it's like, get what you can while you can. It's unspiritual. Somebody said, like living without having windows to the next world. There's no understanding that God sees everything, that God is sovereignly in control, and that He is providentially providing what we need when we need it, when we trust Him. And it's demonic. For where jealousy and selfish ambition exist, there will be disorder and every vile practice. Sometimes people misquote the scriptures and say money is the root of all evil, where it actually says the love of money is the root of all kinds of evil. And it's not every evil. James is saying that every vile practice has in it the roots of jealousy and selfish ambition. So these things are something that we need to ask God to root out of our hearts, but rather to pour in His wisdom. He says in verse 17, but the wisdom from above is first pure, then peaceable. So he says it's first pure and then peaceable, then gentle. And so he describes these 7 adjectives of wisdom. But he says it's first pure. And so it's from this pure place that we are to purify ourselves, John says, as He is pure. And so God has this pure heart. God has this undivided, no variation or shadow of turning. Every good and perfect gift is from Him. He's not a yin and a yang God. He's not a mixture of good and evil. He doesn't tempt us. And so from this place of God's purity, this wisdom that comes from above, we need to see that we also should have these pure hearts that are then peaceable. And so we're going to look at these 7 things quickly, what they describe. So James tells us in verse 17, but the wisdom from above is first pure. In other words, the 7 things he's about to describe flow from a pure heart. They don't make a pure heart. And the first one is, he says, is pure, then peaceable. And that doesn't mean that we just sit back passively or afraid to rock the boat, but it means that we preserve peace where it does exist and promote it where it doesn't exist. And Paul writes to the church in Ephesus, and he says, be eager to maintain the unity of the Spirit in the bond of peace. And so Jesus has made this peace possible by brokering this reconciliation between us and the Father through paying our debt on the cross. And we don't maintain something that we don't already have. So we preserve that peace that we have amongst ourselves. And then where there is a breakdown in relationships, we go and pursue it. Jesus said in the Beatitudes, he said, firstly, blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. And then blessed are the peacemakers, those that go and pursue peace, not the peacekeepers. And so we then move on to gentle, then peaceable and gentle. And somebody said, gentle is being prepared to see the best in even the worst of people, and of being willing to forgive even when one has the right to condemn. There's a story told of this 17th century statesman, William Trumbull. He gets on a train and a drunk guy comes and sits opposite him and then offers him a drink, and he says, no, thank you, I don't drink. A little later in the journey, the process is repeated and he says again, no, thank you, I don't drink. And then the third time when he's taking the bottle out, this drunk guy realizes, hold on a second, and says to the doctor, actually, you must think I'm a beast. And the doctor replies and he says, well, actually, no, I think you're very generous. And that's what's meant by being gentle, when he could have adopted this holier than thou kind of attitude. Nextly, wisdom is open to reason. It means it's been open to be persuaded differently. There's a bumper sticker that says, my mind is made up. Don't confuse me with the facts. And we only know too well, again, we look at the world of politics, how closed people are to good logical reasoning and just adopting many conspiracy theories. Full of mercy. Next, it means to have a spirit of forgiveness, as well as to show mercy to those who are in need. James has already told us in chapter 2 that if we see a brother or sister who's poorly clothed and lacking in daily food, and say to them, go in peace, be warmed and filled, without giving them the things needed for the body, what good is that? So faith by itself, if it does not have works, is dead. And then James says this wisdom is full of good fruits. There was a notice from a guy at a homeless shelter when he left that said this, I was hungry and you formed a humanities group to discuss my hunger. I was imprisoned and you crept off quietly to your chapel and prayed for my release. I was naked, and in your mind you debated the morality of my appearance. I was sick, and you left me alone to pray for me. You seem so holy, so close to God, but I am still very hungry and lonely and cold. Next, James says his wisdom from above is impartial, and he's dealt with that in chapter 2 when he says that people in this church see somebody who comes in well-dressed and they give them a better seat, and a guy's poorly dressed, they ask him to stand at the back, and he's just saying we shouldn't have these mixed kind of responses in our hearts. And then lastly, wisdom from above is sincere, which literally means without hypocrisy. Hypocrisy is just pretending to be something that you're not. There's this printing group that put out an ad once, and they made a fatal mistake in one of their letters, and they said, we fake an interest in all our customers. And so we come to the last verse that we're dealing with today, chapter 3, verse 18. And a harvest of righteousness is sown in peace by those who make peace. Every verse at the end of every chapter in James is a call to action. And this one is saying that we should sow our part into producing right and wise relationships, in making for a healthy community, as opposed to producing a harvest where there would be disorder in every vile practice that we saw comes from earthly and unspiritual approaches to wisdom. And so I've been reading to you this morning from the English Standard Version, which is known as a dynamic equivalent translation, as opposed to a more wooden literal translation that, for example, the New King James Version is. In the original Greek, which the New Testament is written in, you'll find that there's no punctuation, there's no space between words and paragraphs, and there's no lowercase equivalents like we have in English. So everything is in capital letters. And so the New International Version and the English Standard Version, or the ESV, are written in a way that's kind of more friendly to us. We are used to in the way that we read English. But then we also have translations that are what we would call more like a paraphrase, and they are trying to go one step further to the dynamic equivalent, making it more as the intent of what the author's trying to say for application. And one of those is the Message. And so I want to read to you the verses that we've covered this morning in the Message, and just as you listen to it, you'll get a sense of the flow and even understand this last verse that we have dealt with, I hope, in a much better way. James chapter 1 verse 2 says, "Consider it a sheer gift, friends, when tests and challenges come at you from all sides. You know that under pressure, your faith life is forced into the open and shows its true colors. So don't try to get out of anything prematurely. Let it do its work so you become mature and well developed, not deficient in any way. If you don't know what you're doing, pray to the Father. He loves to help. You'll get his help and won't be condescended to when you ask for it. Ask boldly, believingly, without a second thought. People who worry their prayers are like wind-whipped waves. Don't think you're going to get anything from the Master that way. Adrift at sea, keeping all your options open." Chapter 3, verse 13. "Do you want to be counted wise, to build a reputation for wisdom? Here's what you do. Live well, live wisely, live humbly. It's the way you live, not the way you talk, that counts. Mean-spirited ambition isn't wisdom. Boasting that you are wise isn't wisdom. Twisting the truth to make yourselves sound wise isn't wisdom. It's the furthest thing from wisdom. It's animal cunning, devilish conniving. Whenever you're trying to look better than others or get the better of others, things fall apart and everyone ends up at the other's throats. Real wisdom, God's wisdom, begins with a holy life and is characterized by getting along with others. It is gentle and reasonable, overflowing with mercy and blessings, not hot one day and cold the next, not two-faced. You can develop a healthy, robust community that lives right with God and enjoy its results only if you do the hard work of getting along with each other, treating each other with dignity and honor." Straight after telling us what amazing results can flow in our communal relationships when we operate with wisdom from above, James says this in chapter 4 and verse 1, "What causes quarrels and what causes fights among you? Is it not this, that your passions are at war within you?" And just before we describe this wisdom, early on in chapter 3, he said, "But no human being can tame the tongue. With it we bless our Lord and Father, and with it we curse people who are made in the likeness of God. From the same mouth come both blessing and cursing. My brothers, these things ought not to be so. Does a spring pour forth from the same opening both fresh and salt water? And neither can a salt pond yield fresh water." And so we seem to see a pattern that James describes, that it's possible for us to be approaching God, asking for wisdom, and yet be double-minded. We can be under trials and be tempted to think that God is putting us in an evil place when it's our own desires within. Or we can be tempted to have friendship with the world and think that we can still have the same quality of friendship with God at the same time. We can bless and curse from the same mouth. We can have selfish ambition in our hearts and think that we can also have this untainted, pure wisdom that comes from above. And James is saying, no, these things should not be. And so wisdom in of itself is not just a guarantee that everything in life will go well. Solomon was the wisest king who lived on the earth before Jesus comes along. And we're told in 1 Kings that God gave Solomon wisdom and understanding beyond measure and breadth of mind like sand on the seashore. God downloaded this incredible wisdom into Solomon's heart. And he started off so well with examples of that in the stories of the Old Testament. But then we see his reign starts to wane as he begins to have this mixture, this divided heart, because he marries so many foreign wives and compromises in his worship before God. And so even in the New Testament, we find a pillar like Peter going astray in hypocrisy. We read that in Galatians chapter 2, and drawing others into the same sin like Barnabas, And so the answer is the gospel. Paul, rebukes Peter and says, you're not acting in line with the gospel. And the gospel really is, it's the grace of God in our lives that caused our hearts to be made new, that caused our hearts to be pure. And so it's that same gospel of grace that will keep our hearts pure. And James kind of confirms that as he goes along in chapter 4, when he says that God gives more grace, that we have this war and passions going on, but there's more grace. There's always more of what God will offer us than that, which would try to distract us. And so as we allow our hearts to be filled with God, it pushes out those things that would try and taint or distract or produce these mixed results. God opposes the proud, but gives grace to the humble. Submit yourselves, therefore, to God. Draw near to God, and he will draw near to you. So the problem is not from God's side. God is there. God is pouring out his wisdom generously, not finding any fault in us. And he's encouraging us to press through to receive the crown of life. He's giving us this wisdom from above. And so we have all these resources from God, and we have his grace alongside this wisdom that we can draw on daily. And God is encouraging us to be a people that are dependent on him in this walk that we have with him. Paul can write to us, for our boast is this, the testimony of our conscience, that we behaved in the world with simplicity and godly sincerity, not by earthly wisdom, but by the grace of God. And so I want to encourage you to make it a daily practice this week ahead to ask God every day for wisdom and to press into him for the grace that you need to face the relational challenges that you might have, and to just build up those relationships that need to be strengthened. And also just would encourage you to be reading the book of Proverbs, because it's chock full of wisdom and just tells us how we should use our tongues to build one another up and to build strong relationships. So I hope you have a great week, and I hope to see you next Sunday. Remember the Alpha course, and I'll be praying for guys as well to sign up for that.